Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by SCurve Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you. And today, we're talking about the energy transition, oil problems that you may see around the world, decarbonization regulations, and we bring on Markham Hislop to help us with that. How's it going today?
Oh, it's just fine, Ryan. How are you?
Well, let's set the table right off the bat with energy transition. What does that term really mean? And, in the energy world, we throw out terms all the time and we assume that everyone knows what they mean. So kind of define energy transition from your standpoint.
Sure. And let me tell you a little story to kind of set the table here. 30 years ago, when I was in graduate school, I was not an economist. I was a historian of business and technology. And my master's thesis was around the transition from horse-drawn technology to power farming technology, 1900 to 1930. And I know that sounds really dry and has nothing to do with oil and gas, but what I found is that as an energy journalist, all of the theory that I had read back in the mid-1980s applied just as well to the diffusion and the adoption and development and so on of energy technology as it did the farming technology. The basic theory applies. There's nothing special about solar or oil or any of that when you look at it from the energy theory point of view. So what I've done as a journalist is I've developed a little model that I can apply to any technology, and I've applied it to the emerging renewable energies and the clean energy technologies like wind and solar and electric vehicles and battery storage. And the question I wanted to ask is, where are these technologies on the diffusion S-curve? So every technology begins it's at the bottom of the S-curve, and then over a period of time, rule of thumb is about 50 years, kind of works its way up the S-curve, and it becomes dominant at about 70 or 80% of market share. So we keep hearing from the renewable energy advocates that 100% renewable today, and electric vehicles are going to replace internal combustion engine cars, within a decade or two. And what I found was that all of those technologies that I've mentioned are really at the very, very bottom of the S-curve. They're only, they're not that old, really, maybe 5 years, 10 years old. And it's going to be probably 50 years, 75 years, probably the end of this century before those technologies really have a significant impact on the oil and gas industry. And part of that is driven by the size of the energy system that they're impacting. Part of it is driven by the fact that during this century, we're going to see Asian energy demand explode. I think it's predicted to go up by 35 or 40% by 2040. And part of it is just the fact that technologies take a long, long time to develop. So my message to my oil and gas readers is, it'll be your great-great-great-grandchildren who might start to see some kind of an impact on their industry if they happen to be working in it. But these technologies are not going to have a big impact in the short to medium term.
Okay, well, let me just play devil's advocate for a second and say, well, what about Africa, where you see a lot of emerging microgrids that's using renewable technology? Is it possible that those microgrids can start to capture space inside the energy sector that's not being captured by anyone, and could it expedite their growth?
To some extent. I mean, remember the cell phone, right? In Africa, they didn't have landlines, and so they skipped over all of the landline technology and went straight to cellular. And that certainly could happen in Africa, as Africa is a terrific solar resource. And if you don't have to contend with or compete with an existing power system that has power, say coal plants and wires and transmission lines and wires going into every home, then solar doesn't have all that cost that has to be added on the way it does in, say, the United States or Canada. So there's a chance that that solar, in this particular case, might be economic sooner than it would be economic in our markets.
So then what you're saying, just to make sure I'm understanding clearly, is that in the first world countries where we have kind of a large grid system in place, replacing it with large-scale renewables is not viable anytime soon. But in emerging markets, you may see that they kind of skip the process on some levels. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, exactly right, and that has implications for the cost structure and for the cost per kilowatt hour in the case of electricity. One of the things that's what I could do is use since we're talking about cell phones in Africa, the smartphone is a really good example of what the renewable energy advocates point to when they talk about disruptions and they make that assumption that that's going to spread to other technologies. And so I'm old enough to remember when cell phones came in the late 70s, and they weighed 5 pounds and they were cumbersome and expensive. And I think I got my first one in the late 80s. And then in the 90s, when I was consulting, I always had a flip phone or a Nokia or something like that, and they were expensive, and you had to manage your data times. And so what happened is the smartphone comes in with the BlackBerry, and in 2007 the iPhone gets introduced and sales explode. And within a very short time, the cell phone gets to pretty much 100% market coverage. So that's advanced as an argument for a technical disruption that can take a technology from 50%, 60% market penetration to 100% almost overnight or within a very short period of time. But what people forget is just how significant that the smartphone was as an innovation, a technical innovation. Basically, you went from a cell phone that did a couple of different functions, like you get your email, you could use a calculator, to a mini computer in the palm of your hand that happened to make cell calls. And the increase in value is what led to the rapid adoption of the smartphone. So I'm willing to pay $800 for a smartphone where I would only pay $100 for a cell phone, because the value I get as a consumer, especially as a business consumer, is exponential compared to the cell phone. Now, apply that against some of the technologies we talked about, like electric vehicles, solar, and wind. There's not an exponential increase in value in any of those technologies. And head-to-head, if you take a Chevy Bolt and put it head-to-head with pick one of the Chevy Cruze hatchback wagon, which is essentially a very similar car in terms of size and so on, it costs twice as much. It has a 200-mile range, and so on and so forth. The value to the consumer is really quite low, but for that Chevy Bolt, and that's why in head-to-head competition, electric vehicles and wind and solar in particular will take a long time to diffuse through the energy economy.
Now, you've mentioned electric cars a few times in passing. We do hear often, okay, electric cars are the way of the future. And it seems that just the research that I've done is that there maybe if you lived in a very large area, metropolitan area that's built for electric cars, that maybe there's some value there. But the cost, again, seems to be kind of prohibitive. So do you really see electric cars taking over gasoline and diesel car vehicles, or is it a lot more hype to it than actual reality?
At this moment, and for the next 20 to 30 years, it's a lot more hype than it is reality. And what I used to get those arguments all the time. The electric vehicles are going to impact oil demand by 2020. And, if you read Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, or Clean Technica, those arguments are there all the time. You see them on social media. So what I did was, rather than simply repeat studies, I interviewed 6 leading American EV battery scientists. These are people like Dr. YQ out of Stanford, Mike Toney out of Stanford, Halal Arbedelli out of the University of Houston. These are people on the leading edge of electrochemistry research. And all of them, and I mean all of them, had exactly the same message. So what's going to happen in EV batteries is that over the next decade, lithium-ion is going to drop by 50%. The costs are going to drop by 50%. And the energy density is going to go up by 50%. But what that means is now your $37,000 Chevy Bolt is going to cost $32,000 or $33,000, and in 2027 it'll go, maybe 350 miles instead of 200 miles, or maybe 300 miles. So that really doesn't make it much more competitive against the Chevy Cruze hatchback than it was before. A little more competitive, and some people will definitely buy it. Sales are going to increase. Now, here's what's coming, though. All of the electrochemists that I interviewed said that there's significant work going on in very high energy dense chemistries that will be coming out of the laboratory in about 10, 15 years. So lithium sulfur or lithium molten metal. There are probably about 3 or 4 of them. And the University of Texas at Austin, about a month ago, announced that Dr. John Goodenough, who is a professor there, and it was the co-inventor of the lithium-ion battery in the late 70s, has come up with another innovation for solid-state electric EV batteries. So if you look at what's coming out of the laboratory in the next 10 or 15 years, we could see batteries with an energy density 20 times current batteries. So now your Chevy Bolt might go 3,000 or 4,000 miles on a charge.
Yeah, or that's 3,000 or 4,000 miles. Now we're getting some value because
now we're getting some value now. And not only that, if you have that kind of energy density, now maybe you can electrify long haul trucks, garbage trucks, commercial trucks in big cities where pollution is an issue. I mean, now it has a lot more applications and a lot more value than it does when you have very low energy density. But the analysts I talked to said, yeah, that's great. I mean, 10 or 15 years, and then it's going to take another 10 years it'll have to be commercialized. It'll have to pass the Department of Transport regulations. It'll have to be approved by the Department of Transport. And on top of that, automakers take a long time to innovate or to design new innovations into their vehicles. The design phase for a new vehicle is 5 to 8 years. So it'll be another 10 years before these higher density batteries ever show up in an electric vehicle. Well, if we think if that's 25 years, let's say, that's already 2042 from where we stand today. And then the global auto fleet of internal combustion engine cars at that point is going to be 2.4 billion. That's a lot of cars to replace.
And so that's a lot of cars.
So that fleet will probably have to turn over 3 times to get all of the ICE cars out of the fleet, or most of them anyway. So now you're talking, if the average car lasts 15 years, now you're talking another 45 years. Now we're up to 2087. So
I don't think at 2087 I'm going to be worried about too much about it. Obviously, it would impact me a little sooner than that, but 2087 that's a long time away. I mean, that's not around the corner by any stretch of the imagination for someone in the business today.
And that's the message I give to oil and gas men in Texas all the time. Is when you get down when I use my analytical model and I get right down and start doing the shoe leather down on the street and talking to the scientists and the engineers and the utility executives and all of that, you get a very different view of this clean energy technology than you do when you're reading it in Forbes or you're reading it in somewhere else. And so that's what I try to do, is I try to get into the nuts and bolts of it and talk to the people who've got their hands on that technology. And I think you get a truer view of what's really happening there and the impact it might have on oil and gas going forward many decades.
Okay, and so I want to touch on something there, and we'll move on. I'm not a journalist; I'm an energy professional. I work in the business. I have the podcast because I like talking and learning about the energy business. But when I read a lot of articles, whether it's oil and gas or whatever, from media publications, it seems kind of frustrating because whether it's about the price of oil and gas or whatever, there's so many variables that come into play in the energy industry. Rarely does the journalist seem to cover them all. And so you kind of walk around going, okay, well, man, the sky's fallen, or it's the greatest thing ever. But then when you get on the ground, as you mentioned, you talk to professionals, you get a much different picture. And so why is that the disconnect, you think, between journalism and actually people who have their boots on the ground and who are working on this stuff? Why is there such a large disconnect between those two?
That's a really good question, Ryan. And so I started in journalism in the after graduate school in the late 80s. And back in the day, journalists were expected to do a lot of work, interview a lot of experts, and read studies and spend a lot of time on these kinds of questions so that you did the best job you could. And things have changed in the industry quite a bit. A lot of it has to do with the fact that when the internet came along, it basically ate the lunch of the newspapers in both Canada and the U.S. The industry peaked for profitability in 2005 and had been plummeting ever since. And the reason for that is basically that Google and Facebook have taken away its revenue. And when the revenue dries up, you either have to re-engineer the business model, which media has not done, newspapers have not done, or you cut costs. And so they've been cutting and cutting and cutting for a decade. And what's happened now is that newspapers have only skeleton staffs. People are overworked. They very often have laid off the senior reporters who've been around the energy beat for a long time. And they, replace them with kids out of journalism school who just don't have that kind of experience and are too hard, work too hard, really, to take the big picture. And so there's only a few of us. I like to think that I'm part of this group who really take the time and do it the old-fashioned way. Basically, apply old-fashioned journalism to new questions of energy, of the energy industry and energy technology. And I think that answers a lot of your question.
Well, no, and I agree with a lot of what you said there. It just gets frustrating, because I'll have people, friends and colleagues that maybe are in the business or loosely affiliated, and they'll send me an article and said, "Oh my goodness gracious, look at this. What do you think?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, okay, but he didn't cover 2/3 of what he should have covered or she should have covered, whatever, to actually come to this conclusion." So it's kind of hard to actually figure out what's going on. So it is a frustration of mine as someone who's always trying to learn and talk to professionals and understand. When you go out to the media, it's like you said, there's not a lot of work that sometimes it appears, at least, isn't being done. And so just a side quibble there, if you will. So please forgive me.
Well, look, and let me add one more thing to this. I mean, I think everybody knows, especially after the 2016 election campaign, that the media has changed in that a lot of it has become divided along partisan lines. And so it used to be that if you were talking about energy, nobody approached it from a partisan point of view. I mean, you'd have trade magazines that, of course, were very pro-oil or pro-gas or pro-coal or whatever it was. But for the most part, if you're talking about newspapers and even the business pages of the newspapers, they try to do a balanced, objective, nonpartisan kind of view. That's gone, and now we're in these camps, where you can you're either in the Greenpeace camp or you're in the oil and gas camp, and there's no. It's very difficult for most journalists, most publications, to bridge that gap and take a comprehensive, complex, and nuanced view of the kinds of issues. That's what I try to do, and it's one of the reasons why our readership is rising as quickly as it is. People still like that kind of journalism.
Yeah, they do. And as someone, speaking for myself here, who's been to third world countries and seen poverty, I'm for, hey, let's get people power camp, and that's, let's save lives camp. That's kind of where I like to be at. And I think that we've kind of, like you said, the discussion has been so left, so right, whatever, that there's really not a lot of discussion on how do we do that. And, you hear stories of, babies dying and stuff like this because they just didn't have power to put them in an incubator or basic stuff that we don't think about in the U.S. So for me, that's where I want to be is how do we make sure that we're taking care of human lives around the globe? I want to transition though, and let's come back here to the States and Canada. A lot of news been going on as, North Dakota, Keystone, all that. Kind of give us a feel of what's going on, from a Canadian, northern U.S. perspective with the Keystone. What are the feelings up there, and what are people thinking about, Trump and Obama and kind of how all that went down?
Well, Canada has a very different view on the whole issue of climate change and Obama. The Liberal government of Justin Trudeau that was elected in 2015 was very much and still is in the Obama camp. Having said that, Trudeau also approved 2 new pipelines late last year, and 2 more. One more big one is Energy East is going through the review process, and then of course there's Keystone XL, which Prime Minister Trudeau heartily endorses and has talked to President Trump about that. So Canada on the energy side is trying to tap dance very carefully because Trudeau is he actually subscribes to the energy transition model that I just told you about, and I've asked his energy minister that on a couple of occasions, so I can say that with some confidence. And so what that means is, from a political point of view, is that somebody like our prime minister believes both in oil and gas and pipelines and all of the infrastructure and petrochemicals and that stuff, at the same time that he supports wind and solar and electric vehicles and all that, the clean energy technologies. And of course, President Trump doesn't do that. I mean, he's an oil and gas and coal guy, as he said many times. So, but you know what? The way things are, President Trump's focus, going back all the way to the May of 2016, when he gave his first big energy speech in North Dakota, has said very clearly that he will ban OPEC oil from the U.S. and any nation hostile to our interest, is what he said. Now, banning OPEC particularly might not take place, but no doubt you've heard of the border adjustment tax that's being considered in the Paul Ryan Republican tax reform package.
Right.
Yeah. So what that would do is it would put a 20% tax on imports. And there's a very good chance, from what I'm being told, that Canadian oil would be exempted. And Canadian oil is generally heavy crudes, 75% of it, and the kind that are refined down in the Gulf Coast refineries in Texas. And so if that goes through, what that means is that oil from Saudi Arabia and Nigeria and Venezuela would be 20% more expensive right off the get-go than Canadian crude and possibly Mexican crude. And so that would change the dynamics very quickly, and so I think you'd see a lot more an expansion of the oil sands. You'd certainly see the Keystone XL pipeline built in a hurry. You might even see another 1 or 2 pipelines built. And so Canadians are kind of waiting with bated breath to see how that debate within the House takes place and what kind of tax reform legislation is finally introduced to committee, because it could have very significant implications for the integrated Canadian-American oil industry.
Yeah, and some people may not realize that the U.S. imports a lot of its oil from Canada, so this would be a huge advantage for Canada to be able to sell more oil to the U.S. and not have to pay that 20% tax.
Canada provides 40 to 45% of all of the U.S.'s imported oil. And the American production, domestic production, was, before the prices went down in 2015, was 9.5 million barrels a day, and consumption was about 20 million barrels a day. So that's a lot of oil, that a lot of petroleum products that get imported, and Canada provides almost half of that.
Okay, so let's just assume the tax goes through, or it doesn't go through. It doesn't really matter. One of the things that we see in the news every night is there's opposition to pipelines. Don't build the pipeline. And the question that I really want to ask to these people who are opposed to pipelines is, well, what else should we do? This is the safest method. What are our other options? I'm not aware of any other method that's safe. Where is this opposition coming from? Is there any real good reason for it, or is it more just propaganda we're seeing?
This is a very key question, in my opinion, for both the Canadian and American oil and gas industries going forward, because it's very clear that the environmental movement is very well funded, it's very strong and well organized, and it has, over the course of the last decade, managed to pull the political debate around energy to the left, and much more in favor of renewable energy and wind and solar and so on. Now, there was a survey that was done about the middle of last year. I think it was by the Independent Petroleum Producers Association, and what they asked people was how much. And this was done to an American audience. They said, how much of America's electricity do you think is produced by renewables, primarily solar and wind? And the response was, well, we think about 20% today, and it'll be about 35% in 5 years. Well, the correct answer is 5% for wind nationally and 1% for solar. So you see that the environmentalists have been very successful in planting in people's minds the fact that these clean energies are, they're here, they're expanding rapidly, they're going to take over coal and oil and gas, and it's possible to foresee in our lifetime fossil fuel-free economy. And the reality is not there. And so the question for the energy industry is, how do you respond to that? Now, the energy industry, which is, I have to say this, Ryan, is a terrible communicator. They don't do a very good job of communicating with the public and building the case for oil and gas, because they've never had to. For the last century and a bit, the oil and gas were you've had Alex Epstein on, and Alex makes the argument around the moral case for fossil fuels and what fossil fuels have done for health and lifestyles and poverty and all of that. And all of that is true, by the way. I completely agree with that. And people kind of take that for granted, and now they see we're going to the next phase, and they think that, and what the energy industry generally does is counter that view with facts and science and studies and engineering and so on. People don't want to hear that. They want the emotional argument. They want the vision, the utopian view that the Greenpeaces of the world sell. And that's very attractive to those folks who are kind of independent and Democrats and on the Green Party types in the United States. And I don't think that the oil and gas industry in the U.S. they tend to discount that. I think that's a political miscalculation myself.
No, and I agree, because if you look at the guests that we've had on and the ones that we've got lined up that haven't been released yet, one of the problems that we have is getting on big oil guests, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But that big oil is tight-lipped. If you go like guys like us who work for big oil companies, it's very, very quiet, hush hush. Don't tell anybody what's going on. And so that transpons out into the world where you're trying to do marketing campaigns and stuff like that. So hopefully that paradigm will shift. And that's one of the reasons that we've got this podcast, is to bring on varying views, to get the ideas out there, to let people understand that there's more to it than what they read in magazine A, B, or C. And so hopefully we'll see big oil change their view on how they do that in the future. But we'll see. One final thing before I let you go. I want to
Ryan,
yeah,
can I just make
go
one point?
ahead.
Because this is a really key point. I get invited all the time to go out and speak to debates and to audiences of Green Party type members, Greenpeace type members, and they always bring me in to defend the oil industry and the pipelines, and they think that I'm going to come in and give them the Alex Epstein fossil fuels are a moral good kind of argument. I don't do that, and what I do works really, really well with the average person who's looking for a rational explanation. I explain my energy transition model to them. I show them where the new technologies are on the S-curve, how long it's going to take those technologies to get up the S-curve, 50, 70, 50, 80, and so on. And then I explain to them that in that time period, the new technologies will compete with the old technologies. Oil and gas are going to compete with renewables, and it'll be a long time before the new ones are competitive with. And so we have to the market will decide when electric vehicles are more competitive than gas vehicles, and they begin to displace them, that sort of thing. And when you explain it as a process, and that we're at the very, very beginning of the process, and we still need oil and gas for decades and decades and decades, while the process unfolds, the average person goes, oh, that's perfectly reasonable. Now I understand. Yes, I think we need pipelines. And I think that if the energy associations did that kind of community relations, public relations, and got that message out, I think they would have that the average voter would have a very different perception of pipelines, oil, and gas.
Absolutely, and you mentioned the free markets there, and that's really what, as consumers, we want the markets to compete. We don't want the government pushing this or pushing that, and making an imbalance in the market to where you don't really fully understand. So no, we definitely want the free markets to compete, to figure out what is the best product for the consumer, because that's how it makes our lives better. So no, I can definitely appreciate that look on things. Okay, so one final thing I want to get to is, let's talk about the oil sands. In the U.S., you kind of, here we go with the journalism thing, but you kind of see these pictures of the oil sands and how they're tearing up the environment and they're the worst thing ever. What's the reality with these Canadian oil sands?
The oil sands are the third biggest oil reserve in the world, behind Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. There's 178 billion barrels of recoverable oil in the oil sands. That's how big they are. Now, it's kind of, if you looked at bitumen, which is the oil that's mixed up with sand, and it's very heavy. In fact, it has the consistency of peanut butter, if you can imagine that. So to get it out of the ground, there are two primary methods that are used. One, and this is the first one that started back in the 80s and gained popularity in the 90s, was to mine it. And so you get these huge, scoop shovels, or not scoop shovels, that sounds not, but, huge scoops, and you put them in these huge dump trucks, and you take them to a huge facility, and you basically mine it. And then you have, like any mine has tailings, and they go in a tailings pond, and the tailings pond looks terrible. Now, the upshot to that is that the companies are required by law that when that plant is decommissioned, they have to clean it up and remediate it and return it back to its natural state. So 20, 30, 40 years from now, a lot of those plants are going to be at the end of their economic life, and they will be taken back to a natural state. So whatever they look like now, they're not going to look like that down the road. Now, the second thing is, the more popular, this accounts now for something like 70 or 80% of all the oil that's produced, is called in situ. And what do you do there? This will be more familiar to Texas producers who are drilling horizontal wells and using hydraulic fracturing. So what the company does is it drills down, and it's got a long lateral on and it drills two wells. So they've got, one is just above the other one. And so the one well, they both have long laterals, and the one lateral into that well goes steam. And the steam then melts, it increases the viscosity of the oil, and then the oil drips down into the second lateral, and that's how it gets produced. And you guys have got steam floods down in the Permian Basin. I mean, steam flooding is not unknown to Texas producers. So that has a much smaller footprint. It doesn't have tailings ponds, and that is becoming the predominant way to produce the oil. Here's where the dirty oil label comes from. Because the natural gas is required to create the steam, the Alberta heavy oil has about a 30 to 35% higher carbon intensity than the average U.S. Oil grade, and so that's where Greenpeace comes up with the dirty oil label. And what happened is, a couple of years ago, a left-leaning government was elected in Alberta, and they brought in a lot of climate policies. And the big oil sands producers have actually bought into this. And one of the objectives is that they want to, the government wants the producers to adopt new technology that brings that carbon intensity back down to where it's the average of U.S. oil. So it won't be dirty oil anymore. And what they've done, and it's funny you should ask that question, because I was before I came on your show today, I was writing a column about a report that shows there are 6 new technology pathways that oil sands producers can adopt that will not only lower their carbon intensity, it'll also lower their operating costs. And so once again, what we're seeing, and you see this in the oil and gas industry all the time, it's a very innovative, very technology intensive industry. Technology is coming to the rescue. And so this technology that the producers have, some of them have developed, and it's being adopted throughout the industry, over the next 10 years, maybe 15 years, is going to change the industry in ways that will bring it back into the norm, and it'll look a lot more like, say, the Texas industry.
Well, look, you have been very gracious with your time. I feel like we could go on and on and on for a lot more than this, but I need to let you get out of here. You've been super gracious. Where can people find you and learn more about what you have going on, keep up with you online, and just generally connect with you?
They can find our website at www.theamericanenergynews.com. And if they look on the front page, they'll see a category link to Markham on Energy, and they can find all of my columns there. In addition, we have other categories, including Texas, where we publish energy news all the time. But if they want to read my analyses and my columns, then they can look at the Markham on Energy category.
Great. And I found you on Twitter, I believe, so we will link to your Twitter profile there as well, so the audience can reach out to you guys on Twitter. You post a lot of stuff, a lot of good stuff that's helpful. So thank you so much for coming on. This has been very, very informative. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and we look to have you on again in the future.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for having me, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again.
Well, I hope you really enjoyed that. I did. I'm not going to keep you much longer. It was a really, really long interview, but quick reminder, the Trump 100-day roundtable discussion is just around the corner. Would love to hear your feedback on that. As always, you can reach me at globalenergymedia.com/contact. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by SCurve Global.